The creek took everything from Caleb Mercer the night he waded into a flash flood for a woman whose name he didn't know, and 6 years of work, sacrifice, and scraped together hope nearly drowned with her in the dark. He didn't know it yet. Nobody in that valley knew it yet. But the woman gasping in the mud on his bank, she owned every fence post he'd ever driven, every trench he'd ever dug, every prayer he'd ever whispered into that dry Wyoming soil. If this story already has your heart pounding, hit subscribe right now, and drop your city in the comments. I want to know how far this story has traveled. Stay with me all the way to the end. You are not going to believe where this goes. The storm came in the way bad news always does in Wyoming, fast, without warning, and meaner than anything a man could prepare for. Caleb Mercer had been riding the south fence line when the sky turned the color of a bad bruise, that particular shade of greenish-purple that old-timers called a killing sky. He'd seen plenty of summer storms tear through Dry Creek Valley. He'd patched the barn roof twice after wind took it, dug a channel by hand when the spring runoff nearly swamped his lower pasture, and once stood in chest-deep water for 3 hours pulling a heifer out of a flooded gully. Wyoming didn't ask a man's permission before it tried to break him. That was something Caleb had understood since he first rode into this valley at 28 years old with $40, a decent horse, and the stubborn belief that work could eventually become ownership. He was wrong about that last part, but he didn't know it yet. He turned his horse north and pushed hard toward the ranch. The rain hit him about a mile out, not the gentle kind that settled dust and sweetened the grass, but the violent, sideways kind that felt like gravel thrown by an angry hand. Lightning cracked so close he smelled the burn of it. His horse, a steady gray gelding he called Jericho, didn't spook easily, but even Jericho pinned his ears and shortened his stride, wanting nothing more than the dark safety of the barn. Caleb almost missed it entirely. He was keeping his head low against the rain, hat brim down, watching the ground for mud holes, when Jericho suddenly threw his head up and shied hard to the left. Caleb felt the shift before he understood it, grabbed a fistful of mane on instinct, and then heard it a sound that didn't belong inside a thunderstorm. A human sound, somewhere beneath the roar of rain and rushing water. He pulled Jericho up and listened, nothing for 3 seconds. Then there, a voice barely. Caleb swung down without thinking and moved toward the creek. The creek at Dry Creek Ranch was ordinarily a modest, well-behaved thing, 8 feet wide in summer, shallow enough to wade without getting your thighs wet. Right now, it was something else entirely. Flash floods were the particular cruelty of Wyoming canyon country. 15 minutes of hard rain 10 miles upstream could turn a sleepy creek into a freight train of brown water and broken timber before anyone on the low ground had time to think. The creek had already jumped its banks. Water churned through the cottonwood roots and spread wide across the bottom ground, shallow near the edges but moving fast enough to knock a man down. The overturned carriage was hung up in the cottonwoods about 30 yards downstream from the crossing. One of the horses was gone entirely. The other was down in the water, tangled in the harness, struggling and thrashing, with the desperate energy of an animal that knows it is dying. The carriage itself had caught against a cluster of cottonwood trunks and sat tilted at a savage angle, one wheel spinning in the current, the underside exposed like the belly of a dead animal. Water was already pushing over the top of the lower door. Caleb could see a hand, small white, gripping the edge of the carriage door frame with the kind of grip that meant the person on the other end of it was running out of strength. He went into the water before he had a conscious plan. The cold hit him like a fist. Even in July, Wyoming creek water carried snowmelt cold that grabbed the breath right out of a man's chest. He went into his knees, then his thighs, then the current caught him, and he had to angle himself sideways and drive his boots into the creek bed to stay upright. The water pushed against his legs with frightening authority. Not the weight of water exactly, but the persistence of it, the way it found every weakness in his footing and pressed. "Hey," he shouted toward the hand. "Hey, can you hear me?" The hand moved. "Grip tighter. I'm coming. Don't let go." He worked his way along the cottonwood trunks, using them as handholds, feeling the bark rough against his palms, letting the trees take some of what the current wanted to take from him. The trapped horse was between him and the carriage. He gave it a wide berth, not because he didn't care about the animal, but because a panicking horse in water could kill a man just as dead as drowning could, and dead men couldn't help anybody. When he got close enough, he saw her. She was pinned from the waist down beneath part of the broken carriage frame, not crushed. He didn't think, but caught, the twisted iron bracket wedged against the door frame with the carriage's own weight. And the angle of the tilt was pressing her sideways into the water. Her head and shoulders were above the surface, barely. Her free hand was what he'd seen. The other was trapped beneath her. She was young, dark hair plastered across her face. Eyes wide and fixed on him with the particular focus of someone who has moved past panic into something quieter and more terrifying. "Can you breathe?" he said. "Yes." Her voice was steady, which surprised him. "My ankle. Something's got my ankle. I see it. I'm going to get it off you." He looked at the bracket. It wasn't a simple lift. The weight of the carriage was holding it in place, and the angle was wrong. The current was pushing the frame harder against the door every second. He needed to move the door first. "You're going to feel this move. It's going to hurt. You tell me if you feel anything give way wrong." "All right." He braced his boots against cottonwood root beneath the water, got his shoulder under the door frame, and pushed. The current immediately did what currents do: it used the movement to push harder in the opposite direction he needed. The whole carriage shifted slightly, and the woman made a short, controlled sound. Not a scream, more like a word she'd decided not to finish. "Still with me?" Caleb said through his teeth. "Still here," she said. "Don't stop." He didn't stop. He shifted his position, lost his footing for a terrifying half-second, found it again, repositioned his shoulder and pushed with everything he had left in him, felt something give, not break, but shift. The bracket catching on something new and releasing something old, and the woman gasped and pulled her ankle free. The carriage lurched at the same moment. He grabbed her arm. The second surge hit them both, before either of them was ready for it. Water that had been building against the cottonwood tangle upstream suddenly released all at once. A wall of cold pressure that swept them both off their feet and sent them tumbling into the current together. Caleb got a mouthful of creek water, lost her arm for one black second, felt the absolute certainty that he'd failed. And then his boots hit gravel, and he drove himself upright by pure stubbornness and found her arm again and hauled toward the bank. The bank seemed impossibly far. Later, he couldn't have said exactly how they got there. He remembered cottonwood branches, the scratch of them. He remembered her weight across his arm. He remembered his own breathing, ragged and deliberate, the way a man breathes, when breathing is the only thing left between him and giving up. He got his knee onto the muddy bank, then his other knee. Then he pulled her up beside him and collapsed onto his hands in the mud and stayed there for several seconds, just breathing. She was coughing beside him, hard coughs, the kind that brought water up. He turned her onto her side without asking permission, because this wasn't a moment for manners, it was a moment for keeping a person alive, and after a moment the coughing eased and she pulled in a real breath, and then another. Rain still came down hard. Lightning worked across the ridgeline to the east. The creek roared behind them. Caleb sat back on his heels and looked at her. She was looking at him already, even now soaked and shaking. There was something in how she looked at him, not the glazed shock he'd expected, but something deliberate. Measuring, like she was already trying to understand the situation she was in. Then her expression changed. Something gave way behind those eyes, something controlled that had been holding the fear back, and she reached up and gripped the front of his shirt with both hands. "I owe you my life," she whispered. Caleb looked at her for a moment. At the creek still roaring behind them, at the rain coming down on both of them. "Then keep it," he said. He got to his feet, pulled her upright, and when she put weight on her left ankle and her face went white, he picked her up without discussion and started carrying her toward the ranch house. She didn't argue. People who've nearly drowned tend not to argue about being carried. "What's your name?" "Rebecca," she said, a pause. "Rebecca Lane." "Caleb Mercer," he said. "You're going to be all right, Miss Lane." She didn't answer that. He figured she was too worn out to. He walked on through the rain. She slept for almost 14 hours. Caleb had put her in the back room. It was barely a room. More of an addition his predecessor had tacked onto the ranch house sometime in the 70s, but it had a real bed and a window, and it was dry, which was more than could be said for large portions of Caleb's own life. He'd found dry clothes, too small but clean, and left them folded outside the door without knocking. He'd bandaged his own forearm where something in the creek had opened a cut he hadn't noticed until he was standing in his kitchen and dripping blood onto the floorboards. He'd fed Jericho, confirmed the barn was holding, and then sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that went cold, while he tried to remember the last time anything unexpected had happened in his life. 6 years was a long time to spend on one piece of land. Caleb had come to Dry Creek Valley in 1878, following a rumor that an eastern land company was willing to rent pasture cheap to cattlemen who'd put in the management work. The rumor was true. He'd signed a lease on Dry Creek Ranch for a yearly rent that hurt but was possible, taken on a modest herd with borrowed money, and set about the business of making something out of what was, at that point, a moderately beaten-down property with a leaking barn and a fence line that looked like it had lost a war. He repaired the barn. He rebuilt the fence line. He dug a proper irrigation channel from the creek to the lower pasture by hand, 18 days of work that left him sleeping like a dead man every night, and waking up the next morning, somehow willing to do it again. He put in a kitchen garden. He patched the ranch house. He added the lean-to storage shed. He cut and hauled timber for a proper hay store so the herd could winter without him buying expensive supplemental feed at prices that always rose in the hard years. Every improvement was documented in his account ledger, in his own careful handwriting. He had never met the owners. The Langford Estate Management Company, as it was formally named in his lease documents, communicated entirely by letter. Quarterly rent was sent by bank draft to a Cheyenne address. Occasionally a letter arrived from someone named Crowley, who signed himself as estate manager, acknowledging receipt and noting that Mr. Mercer's rental history was considered satisfactory. That was as close to praise as the arrangement ever came. Caleb had asked once, in the 3rd year, whether there was any possibility of purchasing the property. Crowley had replied that the estate held multiple properties across Wyoming and Kansas and that sales were not currently under consideration, but that Mr. Mercer's inquiry had been noted. He'd been noted. He kept working. By 1884, by this summer, the summer of the flood Dry Creek Ranch, was a different place than the one he'd found. His herd had grown to 90 head of solid quality cattle. His credit at the Millhaven General Store was good. His reputation in the valley was the kind built slowly, which meant it held men hired his advice about fence placement and water rights. Ranchers bought his bull calves at fair prices. And nobody in Dry Creek Valley would have described Caleb Mercer as a failure. But he still didn't own the ground beneath him. That fact sat inside his chest the way a stone sits inside a boot. You could walk on it. You learned to adjust around it. But it was always there. He went to bed when the storm finally wore itself out sometime past midnight. He slept the way a man sleeps who has worked himself completely empty, without dreaming. He was already at the stove when he heard her in the doorway. "Mr. Mercer." He turned. She was standing in the frame, wearing the oversized shirt and trousers he'd left out, and she was moving carefully, keeping weight off the left ankle, but her back was straight and her eyes were clear. What was left of last night's rain on the window made the morning light soft and gray. She looked in the daylight, like she'd looked in the dark self-possessed, in a way that didn't fit the circumstances. People who'd nearly drowned were usually still rattled the next morning. This woman looked like she'd been awake for an hour already making decisions. "How's the ankle?" "He's sore. Manageable." She looked around the kitchen. Her gaze stopped on the far wall. Caleb's account ledger hung beside the door on a nail, the way most men kept a calendar or a list of chores. Next to the ledger was an old property map, something the previous renter had left behind, and that Caleb had kept because it showed the irrigation sources clearly. It was yellowed at the edges. He'd stopped really seeing it years ago, the way you stop seeing things that have always been there. He saw her see it, saw something change in her expression. She looked at the map for longer than a map like that warranted. Then she looked back at him, and whatever had changed in her face was already controlled again, smooth and neutral, but he'd caught the edge of it, some flash of something he couldn't name. "You want coffee?" he said. "Yes, please," she said. "Thank you." She sat down across the table from him. He set the coffee in front of her. For a moment neither of them spoke, and it was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the kind that happens between people who are both, for their own reasons, thinking hard. "Are you hungry?" he said. "I could eat," she said. He put a pan on the stove. She wrapped both hands around the coffee cup and looked at the map again. Then she looked at the ledger, at the careful columns of Caleb's handwriting, visible even from across the room. "Is that your account book?" she said. "Yes, ma'am." "You keep your own accounts?" "Nobody else going to do it for me." She nodded slowly, as if that confirmed something she'd already suspected. "How long have you been on this property?" 6 years come October." She turned the coffee cup slowly. "Do you own it?" He smiled without meaning to. Not a happy smile exactly, more the smile a man makes when the same question he's asked himself 1,000 times comes out of someone else's mouth. "Everything except the ground," he said. She was quiet. He cracked eggs into the pan and watched them cook. "Some Eastern company owns the deed. Langford something. They send a manager around sometimes, fellow name of Crowley. I pay my rent and he sends me a letter saying I'm satisfactory. He let that word land where it deserved to land. 6 years satisfactory and no nearer to owning it than the day I wrote in. Have you tried to purchase it once? Was told sales weren't under consideration. He slid eggs onto a plate and set it in front of her. I keep enough in a savings account that if they ever change their mind, I can make an offer that might be taken seriously. Someday." He sat down with his own plate. "It's slow work." She looked at the eggs, then at him. "And in the meantime, you keep improving the property." "It still needs doing," he said. "Whether I own it or not, the fences still need fixing. The cattle still need managing. The water still needs to run right. That's the work. You do the work because it's in front of you." He picked up his fork. "Doesn't make sense to let a thing go to ruin just because somebody else holds the paper on it." Rebecca Lane looked at him across that kitchen table with an expression he couldn't read. She said, "That's an unusual way to think about it." "Maybe," he said. "Eat before it goes cold." She stayed. He hadn't asked her to. He hadn't exactly told her she couldn't either. When he'd said, the morning after the flood, that she was welcome to rest her ankle before traveling on, she'd thanked him politely and said that would be appreciated. That was 3 days ago. The ankle was genuinely bad enough to make travel impractical. She moved around the ranch with a stick he'd cut for her from a straight cottonwood branch. And even so, she favored it badly, and he'd caught the pain cross her face twice when she thought he wasn't looking. Caleb told himself it was simple hospitality. Wyoming frontier hospitality was a real thing. You didn't turn out an injured woman with nowhere immediate to go, not when you had a spare room and enough food. He told himself that was the whole of it. The problem was that Rebecca Lane was not staying the way he'd expected a stranded traveler to stay. He'd expected helplessness mostly, grateful passivity. The polite awkwardness of a woman out of her element, waiting for the situation to resolve itself. That was what he knew of women in precarious circumstances. His mother had been one, for most of his childhood, and the pattern was familiar. Rebecca Lane was not helpless. On the second morning, he came in from checking the herd to find her at his kitchen table with his account ledger open in front of her and a sheet of paper covered in her own figures beside it. He stopped in the doorway. "I hope you don't mind," she said, not looking up. "I was restless and your accounts were right there." She drew a line under a column of numbers. Mr. Mercer, has your cattle buyer always been Hendricks out of Millhaven? Past 3 years, he said, moving carefully into the room. And you've been selling at market rate. He tells me market rate. He's been telling you 35 cents below market rate. She turned the ledger to face him and tapped a column with one finger. Here, here, and here. Consistent short pricing across 3 years. Not enough in any single sale to obviously argue, but if you total the difference, she slid the paper across to him. He looked at the number. His jaw tightened. That's a significant underpayment, he said. Yes, she said, it is. She pulled the ledger back. I also see a drainage problem in your South Pasture accounts. You've been noting lower than expected yields from that section every August for 4 years and attributing it to summer heat. It's not heat. It's water table. Your south fence line sits in a natural collection basin. The ground stays wet long enough after rain to stress the grass roots. She looked up at him. If you cut a shallow secondary channel 15 yards north of the existing one, it would drain that basin, and you'd gain reliable summer grazing on those acres instead of losing it. Caleb stood across the table from this woman he'd fished out of a flooding creek 4 days ago and tried to reconcile what he was looking at with what he'd expected to be looking at. How do you know drainage, he said. My grandfather ran cattle, she said. It was true enough. I grew up watching him manage accounts. And you know cattle prices? I know most things I've made an effort to learn, she said simply. Are you going to look at the drainage problem or not? Because the South Pasture is your largest grazing section, and if I'm right, you've been losing 15 to 20% of its summer capacity. He pulled a chair out and sat down. He looked at the ledger where she was pointing. She was right. He could see it now, laid out in 4 years of his own careful handwriting, the pattern invisible until someone showed him how to look at it from the outside. The consistent August drop in South Pasture yield. The notes he'd written, and never connected to anything structural. All right, he said. All right. You're probably right about the drainage. He looked at her. What do you know about fence wire gauge? She almost smiled. It moved across her face and stopped just short of arriving. Enough, she said. Why? Come look at the south fence tomorrow if your ankle holds, he said. I want a second opinion on whether I need to replace the whole line or if I can splice it. She nodded. I'll look at it. That evening he watched her sit on the porch steps as the sun went down and look out across the valley with an expression he couldn't quite name. Not contentment exactly, not sadness, something between the two. Something that looked like a person measuring the distance between where they are and where they are supposed to be. He sat down on the step below her, which put them nearly at eye level because she was taller than she first seemed, and said nothing for a while. Where were you headed, he finally asked, before the storm? She was quiet for a moment. Millhaven originally. Then further on. Another pause. Longer of a kind, she said. He let that be what it was. You're going to be all right, he said eventually. Whatever you've got waiting on you. She looked at him sideways. How do you know that? Because you know cattle pricing and drainage and fence wire gauge, and you look at a problem like you intend to solve it rather than wait for it to solve itself, he said. That kind of person generally ends up all right. Rebecca Lane looked away toward the western ridge where the last light was going. Sometimes, she said quietly, knowing how to solve problems isn't the same as being willing to. He didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing. And they sat there in the cooling summer evening while the first stars came out over Wyoming and the creek ran ordinary as though it had not been trying to kill them both 4 nights ago. On the 6th morning, Crowley arrived. Caleb was in the barn when he heard horses on the road, and he came out with a piece of harness still in his hand to find a neat black buggy pulled up in front of the ranch house. The driver was a man Caleb recognized by sight, if not by acquaintance. Silas Crowley, estate manager for the Langford Holdings, had ridden out twice in 6 years to walk the property and review the lease, and Caleb knew his silhouette. Polished boots, a good coat, a hat that cost 3 times what Caleb's did. the look of a man who managed other men's money and had learned to dress the part. Crowley stepped down from the buggy and looked at Caleb with the distant courtesy of a man who had dealt with tenants long enough to find it unremarkable. "Mr. Mercer," he said, "I heard there was some flood damage in this area." "Some," Caleb said. "Creek jumped its banks Tuesday night. We came through all right." "Good." Crowley's eyes moved to the ranch house, to the window where the curtain shifted slightly. Something in his expression changed. It was brief, a second of surprise, immediately controlled, but Caleb caught it. "You have company?" Crowley said. "Rescued a traveler from the flood," Caleb said. "She's resting a bad ankle," before moving on. Crowley looked at the window again. "I see," he said in a tone that contained things Caleb couldn't parse. "You want coffee, Mr. Crowley?" Caleb said. "I won't trouble you. I'm simply riding the property lines, accounting for any damage the estate should know about." He was still looking at the ranch house. "Nothing else to report?" "Nothing," Caleb said. Crowley looked at him, a look with too much in it for a routine property inspection, and nodded. "Well then, good day, Mr. Mercer." He climbed back into the buggy and drove away. Caleb stood in the yard and watched him go with the specific feeling a man gets when something happens that he hasn't understood yet. He went inside. Rebecca was at the table, both hands flat on the tabletop, looking at the door. "That was Crowley," Caleb said. "Estate manager." "I know who he is," she said. He looked at her. "You know him?" She looked at him steadily. "He was there once when I was younger." "I've seen him before." She picked up the pencil she'd been using on the accounts and put it down again. "He didn't say anything about me?" "No," Caleb said. "Just a routine property inspection." Her shoulders released slightly. "All right," she said. "Then, Mr. Mercer, what did you say when I asked if you owned this property?" "Everything except the ground," he said, watching her. "And if they sold it," she said carefully, "if the estate decided to sell, where would you be?" 30 days to vacate," he said. "That's what the lease says. Standard provision." He leaned against the door frame. "Why?" She looked at the ledger, then at the map. "Just thinking about the accounts," she said. But she wasn't looking at the accounts. She was looking at his 6 years of work on property that someone else held the paper on. And Caleb, watching her, had the sudden strange feeling that something had shifted in the room without moving. Some weight redistributed. Some balance changed. He just couldn't yet tell which direction it had gone. That evening, after dinner, Rebecca sat on the porch steps again and opened the battered leather case she'd been carrying since the flood, the only piece of luggage that had survived, pulled out of the creek mud that first morning. She'd kept it close. He'd assumed it was personal effects, correspondence, the ordinary things a traveling woman carried. She opened it carefully. He saw from where he sat behind her in the doorway that she pulled out a folded letter. She read it. He saw her hands tighten on the paper. She read it again. He didn't ask. It wasn't his letter. But he watched her sit very still in the last of the evening light, and something about the way she sat, not sad, not frightened, but the stillness of a person who has just received information that requires an immediate response, made him feel the shift again. That same change of weight from earlier. She folded the letter carefully and pressed it flat against her knee with both hands. Then she looked out at the valley, at the fences running north toward the ridgeline, at the hay stored in the barn he'd rebuilt, at the irrigation channel visible in the low-angled evening light as a line of darker green cutting across the dry summer grass. At everything Caleb Mercer had built on ground that was not legally his. She stayed there for a long time. When she finally came inside, she did not mention the letter. But something in her had changed that Caleb could feel without being able to name. Something that had been undecided had now been decided. He just didn't know yet what the decision was. She didn't sleep that night. Caleb knew it because the ranch house was small enough that a person moving around in it registered as sound of floorboard, a chair shifting, the soft creak of the back room door opening and closing. He lay in his own bed and listened to her not sleeping, and thought about the letter she hadn't mentioned, and the way her hands had tightened on it, and the way she'd looked at his fences afterward, like she was trying to decide something about them. He told himself it wasn't his business. He told himself that in the morning she'd probably ask him to help arrange transportation to Millhaven, and he'd do it, and he'd go back to the business of being alone on a piece of land he'd spent 6 years pretending might someday belong to him. He almost believed it. By the time gray light showed under his door, he heard her in the kitchen. He got up, pulled on his boots, and went to find her standing at the stove with his coffee pot in her hand, and an expression on her face that said she'd made whatever decision she'd been working on all night and wasn't going to discuss it directly. "Morning," he said. "I'd like to stay a few more days," she said. "If you'll have me." He pulled a chair out and sat down. "Ankle still bad?" She looked at him levelly. "The ankle is improving." "All right," he said. She poured the coffee. "You're not going to ask why," she said. "Not my habit to ask people their reasons for things," he said. "You want to stay, you can stay. You work for your keep, same as before." That's the arrangement. She sat down across from him with her own cup. Outside, the morning was coming up clear and hot the way Wyoming mornings did, after a hard storm like the violence of the previous days had burned itself out and left something clean and too bright behind. "I want to look at the rest of your accounts," she said. "Not just the cattle sales, the lease terms, the maintenance records. All of it." He looked at her over his coffee. "Why?" She met his eyes and didn't look away. "Because something isn't right in them," she said. "And I think you deserve to know what." He set his cup down. "What have you found?" "I'm not sure yet," she said. "That's why I need to look at all of it." He studied her for a long moment, this woman who'd come out of a flood with a ruined traveling case and a letter that made her hands shake. Who knew drainage angles and cattle pricing and how to read an account ledger with the ease of someone who'd been doing it since childhood? Who'd been on his property 6 days and already found an error that represented 3 years of underpayment that added up to more than most cowboys made in a year. "Ledgers on the wall," he said. "Leases in the box on the shelf. Maintenance records go back to '79. He picked his coffee back up. "Don't let me interrupt you." Something shifted in her face. Not quite relief, something more complicated than that. "Thank you," she said quietly. She was already at the shelf before he'd finished the sentence. What she found took her 2 days. She worked the way he worked, thoroughly, without hurry, without drama. She asked questions when she needed to, and was quiet when she didn't. She borrowed his pencil and bought 2 sheets of paper from her traveling case and covered both sides of them with careful columns of numbers, cross-referenced figures, and dates and repair costs going back half a decade. Caleb went about his days. He checked the herd. He repaired a section of fence along the north line. He cut the secondary drainage channel she'd recommended in the south pasture 3 days of hard digging that went and covered in dirt, and quietly certain she'd been right about the water table. He brought her food when he cooked it. She thanked him each time with the same precise courtesy, the kind that made him think she'd been raised in a household that expected manners at all times, and then went back to what she was doing. On the evening of the second day, he came in from the south pasture to find her sitting very still at the table with both hands flat on the paper in front of her, and her mouth pressed into a thin, controlled line. He'd seen that expression once before, on the porch when she'd read the letter. He sat down. "Tell me," he said. She looked up. "How much do you know about how the estate has been managed?" "I know what the lease says, and what Crowley tells me," he said. "Which is essentially nothing. They've been using your rent," she said, "to fund maintenance on 3 other Langford properties in Kansas and Laramie County." He was quiet. "Your improvement work, the barn, the irrigation, the fencing has increased the property value significantly," she said. "The estate has been noting those improvements in its own accounts as capital gains against the overall holdings." She tapped the page. "Meaning your labor has been used to increase the collateral value of properties you've never seen, for investors who've never met you." Caleb looked at his hands on the table. That legal, he said. It's in the lease, she said, buried in language most men wouldn't read carefully. Your improvements become estate property. They always were. She paused. But there's more. Go on. Your rent has been consistently set at market rate for unimproved pasture land, she said. But Dry Creek hasn't been unimproved pasture land for at least 4 years. What you're actually managing is a fully operational cattle property with working infrastructure. The rent should have been renegotiated, it wasn't. Another pause. Because an accurate renegotiation would have reflected your improvements and raised questions about who was responsible for them. And instead, Caleb said slowly, they kept charging me for a broke-down property, while the records showed an improved one. Yes, so I've been paying rent on something worth less than what I built, he said, and the difference has been profit for the estate. Yes, silence, 6 years, he said. Yes, he stood up. He walked to the window and stood there for a moment with his back to her. She didn't try to fill the silence with comfort, which he was grateful for, because there was no comfort available that would fit inside what he was feeling right now. Something cold and precise was moving through his chest, not anger exactly, though anger was part of it. Something more like the feeling of understanding something that had been true for a long time without your knowledge. The particular indignity of that, the sense that the ground you'd been standing on had been different from what you'd believed, and everybody who knew it had let you go on believing. Is it legal? He said again without turning around. All of it, technically, she said, in the way that many things done deliberately to take advantage of a man who trusts the system are technically legal. He turned around. She was watching him with an expression he couldn't fully read, careful, and something beneath the careful that might have been guilt. Something that looked like it cost her to hold still. What do you want to do with this? He said. She looked at the papers. I'm not sure yet, she said, but I think you should know the shape of it. I appreciate that, he said. He meant it. She nodded once and looked back at the papers. He went to put more wood in the stove. The next morning she asked him to show her the south pasture drainage work. She moved better on the ankle now, still used the cottonwood stick, still avoided uneven ground when she could, but she covered distance without the careful held breath quality she'd had in the first days. They walked down to the south fence line in the early morning when the air was cool and the grass still held the night's moisture, and she looked at the drainage channel he'd cut, at the angle of it, at where it directed toward the creek bed. That's right, she said. That's exactly right. You sound surprised. I'm not surprised, she said. I thought it would work. I'm glad it does. She looked at the south pasture for a long moment. Walked a few paces along the fence line, stopped, looked at the ground. How long did this take, she said. The channel? 3 days. And the fencing, all of it, north to south? 18 days the first time, he said. Portions have been repaired and replaced since. Maybe another 12-15 days total across the years. She was quiet, walking the fence line slowly. And the barn, she said. 8 days to get it sound. Another 4 to get it right. She stopped walking. You did that alone, she said. Mostly. Neighbor helped me lift 2 of the main beams. She turned and looked at him. Not the measuring look she usually wore, not the careful accounting look. Something different. Something that was less organized. And you knew the whole time, she said, that if the estate decided to sell, you'd have 30 days to leave all of it. That's what the lease says, and you kept working anyway. I told you, he said. It still needs doing. She looked at him for a long moment. Caleb, she said. It was the first time she'd used his first name. He felt it, the shift of it, the way it changed the air between them from the formal, careful distance they'd been keeping to something closer. What? He said. She opened her mouth, closed it. Whatever she'd been about to say had collided with something else inside her, and neither of them had come out ahead. Nothing, she said. Never mind. She turned back toward the fence. He watched her for a moment, and then fell into step beside her, and they walked the south line in silence. and he told himself the feeling in his chest was just the peculiar effect of sustained proximity to a person who made his brain work harder than usual. He was not entirely convincing. Crowley came back on the 10th day. This time he didn't stop in the yard. He tied his horse at the post and came directly to the porch door, and knocked with the brisk authority of a man who'd decided that pleasantries were no longer the appropriate tool. Caleb answered. Crowley looked past him into the kitchen, found what he was looking for, and said, "I need a word with your guest, mister." Mercer Rebecca appeared in the kitchen doorway. "I'll be outside," Caleb said. "You can stay," Rebecca said, at the same moment that Crowley said, "In private, if you please." They looked at each other, Caleb and Rebecca, and something passed between them in that look, something that didn't have words yet but carried weight. "I'll be at the barn," Caleb said. He went to the barn. He did not particularly try to work. He sat on an upturned bucket and ran a piece of harness leather through his hands, and thought about the way she'd said his name that morning, and the look on Crowley's face when he'd arrived, and the letter she still hadn't mentioned, and the Langford estate name on his property map. He thought about all of that. And he thought, there is more here than she has told me. He wasn't angry about it, not yet. A person had a right to their own information and their own timing. Whatever Rebecca Lane was carrying, she'd been carrying it longer than he'd known her, and it wasn't his place to demand she set it down on his schedule. But the feeling was there. Quietly, Crowley stayed 20 minutes. When he came out, he didn't look at the barn. He mounted his horse and rode back the way he'd come, and something in how he rode, a tightness, an irritation in the set of his shoulders, told Caleb the conversation had not gone the way Crowley had wanted it to go. He went back inside. Rebecca was at the table again. The papers were in front of her. She was holding a pen but not writing. "You all right?" he said. "Yes," she said. "What did he want?" She looked at the pen in her hand. "He wanted me to sign something," she said. "And I didn't sign it." Caleb sat down. "You going to tell me what's happening?" She set the pen down. She looked at him directly, and there was something in her expression that he recognized as the specific look of a person about to tell you a hard truth and carrying the weight of having not told it sooner. "Not yet," she said quietly, "but soon." "When I understand it better myself," she said. He studied her face. Whatever was in it, the guilt, the carefulness, the thing that looked like it was costing her to hold, still it was real. That much he was sure of. Whatever she was managing it honestly, even if not completely. "All right," he said. She blinked. "That's all? What do you want me to say? You're not ready to tell me." "You'll tell me when you are." He picked up his coffee. "I trust my own read of people, Miss Lane, and my read of you is that you're not going to do anything deliberately wrong." She looked at him for a long time. "You don't know that," she said. "No," he said, "I don't." She was very still. "But I'm not particularly scared of being wrong," he said. "I've been wrong before and survived it." Something moved through her expression, relief and pain in roughly equal measure. The way things are when you're both grateful for something and aware it costs something too. "I'll tell you soon," she said. "I know you will," he said. On the 12th day, he came home after riding the east boundary to find her sitting on the porch steps with the traveling case open on her knees and a document spread across both hands. Not the letter. Something different. Larger. Official-looking, the kind of document that carries a seal. She heard him come up and folded it quickly, but not before he'd seen the size of it. Not before he'd seen his own address in neat typeset letters along the top margin. She didn't look guilty. She looked tired. The particular exhaustion of someone who has been making a decision for a long time and is running low on the energy it takes to keep making it. "Tell me when you want supper," he said. He went inside. He stood in his kitchen and looked at the wall where the property map hung and where the ledger hung beside it, and above both of them, in his own handwriting on a strip of paper he'd tacked up years ago as a kind of private declaration, the words "Dry Creek Home." He'd written that in his second year, when he'd still believed it could become true in the legal sense. He stood and looked at it, and thought about a woman on his porch with a sealed document in her hands and his address on it. He thought about the name on his property map, Langford Estate. He thought about Crowley looking past him into the kitchen, with that look of recognition. He thought about Rebecca saying, "I know who he is." He thought about her asking, "What happens if the estate decides to sell?" He stood in his kitchen and thought all of those things in order, and then he stood for a moment more, with the pieces of it arranged in front of him, like fence posts, waiting to be connected by wire. Then he went and started making supper and didn't say a word about any of it. Because he trusted his read of people, and his read of Rebecca Lane said, "Give her time." That evening after supper, she asked him something he hadn't expected. "If you had to leave," she said, "if they threw you off this land tomorrow, what would you take?" He thought about it seriously, because it was a serious question. "My cattle," he said, "my tools, the account records." "Not the ledger. The ledger is the account records." "What else? That's most of what I own," he said. "The rest is improvements I'd have to leave behind." He looked at the room around them, the shelves he'd built, the stove he'd bartered work for, the window he'd replaced with real glass the winter before last. Things get attached to a place. That's the risk of caring about somewhere. "Does it bother you?" she said. "That risk, did it bother me enough to not care?" He shook his head. "No, never did." She was looking at the window. "There are people," she said slowly, "who inherit things they didn't build, who have legal claim to something they've never once touched or repaired or worried about." She wasn't looking at him. "Do you think that's—" She stopped. "Do you think that kind of ownership means anything?" "Depends what they do with it," he said. She looked at him. "A man can earn something he was born with," he said, "and a man can waste something he worked 30 years for. The owning of it is just the starting point. What you do after that is the whole story." She was very quiet. "You sound like you've thought about that," she said. 6 years on somebody else's land will do that to a man," he said. She looked at him then with an expression that was the most unguarded thing he'd seen on her face, all the carefulness gone for just a moment, all the management of what she showed and didn't show. And what was underneath it was something complicated and honest and a little desperate, the look of a person who wants very much to do the right thing and is not yet sure what it is. Then she stood, said goodnight quietly, and went inside. And Katzlib sat in the cooling evening air and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, the specific vulnerability of caring about a situation you don't yet fully understand, with a person you don't yet fully know, on land you've always half believed would disappear from under you. He sat with that feeling for a long while. It was not comfortable. He didn't particularly try to make it so. 2 days later, she told him something real. She came to him in the morning while he was mending tack, and she stood in the barn doorway with the traveling case in her hands and said, "My mother's maiden name was Langford." He didn't move. "My grandfather was Edmund Langford," she said. "He owned properties in Wyoming and Kansas. He died in February." She was watching him with the steady, braced quality of someone who has decided the only direction left is forward. "I came west to see what he left." Caleb set down the piece of harness in his hands. "Langford Estate," he said. "Yes, this property." "Among others," she said. He was quiet. "Is that why you're calling yourself Lane?" he said. "Lane was my mother's name after she married my father," she said. "It's not false, it's just not complete." He looked at her for a long moment, at the traveling case in her hands, at the expression on her face, not defensive, not apologetic exact, but honest in the way a person is honest when they've finally decided that maintaining a position has cost more than releasing it. "How long have you known," he said, "that this property was one of his?" "Since the morning after the flood," she said. The silence that followed was one of the longer silences Caleb could remember sitting inside. "The map," he said. "You saw the name?" "Yes." He stood up. She didn't step back. "Why didn't you tell me?" he said. "Because I wasn't ready," she said, "and because I needed to understand what I was looking at before I said anything. I needed to know what was actually in those accounts. What had been done, what should be done." She paused. And because I was frightened. Of what? Of being seen as something I didn't want to be, she said. He waited. An owner who shows up after the work is done, she said quietly. That was the first thing you'd have thought. It's what any reasonable man would think. And you would have been right to think it. He stood looking at her in his barn doorway, with 6 years of his life laid out behind him, and this woman in front of him who had been sitting at his table for 2 weeks with a deed in her traveling case and his property map on his wall. I was going to be honest with you, she said. I am being honest with you. Right now. Because Crowley came, he said. Something flickered across her face. Because it was time, she said. Crowley coming was just the clock running out. Caleb picked up the harness again, not because he needed to work on it. Because he needed to do something with his hands while he thought. What does Crowley want, he said. He wants me to sign a sale agreement, she said. The whole valley. To a cattle syndicate called the Western Prairie Cattle Company. The tenants received 30 days. Caleb was quiet. You, she said. The Hendersons at North Ridge, the Cook family on the east section. All of them. He looked at her. And you won't sign it, he said. Not a question. He'd already read it in her. No, she said. I won't sign it, why not? She looked at him for a long time. Because I've seen what's actually here, she said. And I know what it's worth. Not to a syndicate. She shifted the traveling case in her hands. To the people who were living on it. He didn't answer. She said, Caleb, I am going to fix what I can fix. I cannot undo what was done with the rent, or the improvements, or the lease terms. But I can change what happens next, she paused. That is what I intend to do. He looked at her for a long time, long enough that she held herself very still, waiting, the way a person holds still, when the answer to a thing matters more than they've admitted out loud. You should have told me, he said, finally. Yes, she said. I should have. He set the harness down. What exactly are you planning, he said. She took a slow breath, and she told him. She told him everything. Not all at once, it came out in pieces, the way truth usually does when a person has been holding it long enough that releasing it feels like setting down something heavy that has left permanent marks on the hands. She told him about Edmund Langford and the inheritance and deed in her traveling case. She told him about Crowley's letters and Nathan's pressure and the Western Prairie Cattle Company's offer that her uncle had already been celebrating as a done thing before she'd even arrived in Wyoming. She told him about the estate books she'd been quietly studying for 2 weeks and what she'd found in them, not just Caleb's underpayment, but patterns across multiple properties. Rents held artificially low in places where improvements weren't happening, and artificially high in places where tenants had built something worth taking. Caleb listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. How much is the syndicate offering, he said. She told him. He let out a slow breath through his nose. That's a lot of money. Yes, she said. And you're turning it down? Yes. He looked at her. Nathan Langford. That's your uncle. My father's older brother, she said. He's managed the family investment side since before I was born. He considers this estate a financial instrument, not she stopped. Not a place where people live. And Crowley works for him? Crowley worked for my grandfather. Now he's trying to work for whoever signs his salary. She paused. He's not a bad man. He's a practical one. There's a difference, and it matters, but right now it amounts to the same problem. Caleb picked up the piece of harness again, turned it in his hands, set it back down. It was a habit she'd noticed. He handled things when he was thinking, the way some men paced. What you told me, he said, about the lease terms, the improvements, the rent underpayment. If you fix that, if you renegotiate the leases, you're going to make less money from this estate in the short term than the syndicate would pay in a lump sum. Yes, your uncle knows that. Yes. And he's going to fight you. Yes, she said, he is. Caleb looked at her steadily. Can he? He can make it difficult, she said. The inheritance is mine outright. My grandfather was specific in the will. Nathan has no legal claim to the property itself. But he has lawyers, he has relationships with buyers and bankers and men who sit on land boards. She met Caleb's eyes. He has the kind of connections that can make a woman's legal ownership very inconvenient in practice. Even when it's clean on paper. Especially then, she said. Because then the fight has to be out in the open, and he doesn't prefer things out in the open. Caleb was quiet again. Then what do you need from me? She hadn't expected that question. Not stated that plainly, not that quickly. She'd half expected argument, or at least the cautious withdrawal, of a man who'd just learned the ground under his feet, had a different owner than he'd believed. She'd been braced for something colder. I don't need anything from you, she said carefully. That's not what I asked. She looked at him. You told me all of this, he said. You could have kept it to yourself longer. You had reasons to. So you told me because you're about to do something, and you needed someone to know the shape of it. He looked at her levelly. What do you need? She was quiet for a moment. The maintenance records, she said. Your account books going back to '79. Documented evidence of the improvement work and the dates it was done. She paused. If Nathan challenges the estate management decisions I make, I need a paper record of what has actually happened on this property. Not what Crowley reported. What actually happened. You have that, he said. It's all on the shelf. I know, she said. I want to be sure you're willing. To help you make a legal record of 6 years of my own work. He almost smiled. Not a happy smile. More like the expression of a man who finds the situation more ironic than amusing. Yes, Miss Langford. I think I can manage that. It was the first time he'd used her real name. It landed differently than she'd expected, not cold. Something more careful than cold. The name of a thing finally named correctly, and all the weight that came with that. Rebecca. He nodded once. Rebecca. The words sat between them for a moment. All right, he said. Tell me what we do first. What they did first was copy every relevant document by hand, because Rebecca had learned from the estate letters that Crowley had a habit of requesting originals for review and returning summaries. She wasn't giving him originals of anything. Caleb wrote quickly and clearly, his handwriting the practiced kind of a man who kept his own books, and she organized the copies into a sequence that told the property's story in undeniable order, the date each improvement was made, the cost, the labor, the subsequent rental income against the property's assessed value before and after. It was 3 days of evening work after the regular ranch day was done. On the second evening, Caleb looked up from the page he was copying and said, "You're building a case." Yes, she said, against the syndicate, against any argument that this property should be sold, she said. If Nathan's people claim the land isn't being properly managed, I need to show what proper management actually looks like. She looked at her own columns of figures. I need this valley on paper the way it actually is, not the way Crowley's summaries made it look. Caleb put his pen down. Crowley's summaries. He reported the estate holdings as underperforming to justify a sales at below market valuation, she said flatly. The syndicate's offer is actually low for what this land is worth, properly managed. But if the estate's own records show poor performance, any outside appraiser would accept the syndicate's number. Caleb stared at her. He deliberately undervalued the properties, he said. Yes, and Nathan knew. Nathan almost certainly arranged it, she said. Crowley's a practical man, I told you. The quiet that followed was different from the other quiets they'd shared. This one had something hot in the bottom of it. Caleb's jaw was set in the particular way it set, when he was containing something he'd decided not to release. 6 years, he said. And the other tenants. Henderson, she said, to varying degrees. He picked his pen back up. Then let's finish this, he said. They finished it. The morning of the 23rd day since the flood, Caleb was patching the east fence line when he heard horses on the main road. More than one. He straightened and looked, and what he saw coming up the road toward Dry Creek Ranch was not Crowley's neat black buggy. It was a coach, a proper traveling coach, the kind that came from Cheyenne with good horses and a hired driver, the kind that cost money to rent and more money to keep waiting. Riding beside it were two men on good horses, and a third man Caleb recognized as a lawyer from Millhaven named Griggs, who had appeared twice in valley disputes and both times had appeared on the side of whoever had more money. He watched them come. Then he dropped the fence tool, pulled off his gloves, and walked toward the ranch house. He got there ahead of them by about 2 minutes. Rebecca was at the table with the account copies spread in front of her. He came in the door fast and she looked up. "Coach from Cheyenne," he said. "Griggs is with them." Something crossed her face, not fear. Something more like the expression of a person who has been waiting for a thing to start and has just heard the first sound of it. She stood. She straightened her dress with both hands. "How many?" she said. "4, counting the driver." She nodded. "I wasn't leaving," he said. The knock on the door came before she'd finished gathering the papers into order. She opened it herself. Nathan Langford was not Caleb had constructed in his mind. He was shorter than expected, heavier through the chest, with a quality of forceful tidiness, the kind of man who controlled his presentation the way he controlled everything else, as a matter of deliberate management rather than natural inclination. He wore a good suit and a hat that wasn't right for Wyoming heat, and behind his eyes was the specific intelligence of a man who had spent decades arranging other people's outcomes and found it, on the whole, satisfying. Crowley stood at his shoulder. Crowley looked at the floor. Griggs stood behind them both, with a document case under his arm. Nathan's eyes moved past Rebecca to Caleb. Took him in the faded work clothes, the ranch call-used hands, the presence of a man on the property who was not traveling and not temporary. "Rebecca," Nathan said. "Uncle Nathan," she said. Equally not warmly. They came in. Caleb stayed where he was, standing between the shelf and the window, and he said nothing because he had read the situation correctly. His role right now was to be exactly what he was, a man who belonged in this room, and let that fact work without assistance. Nathan sat without being invited. Griggs put his document case on the table and opened it. Crowley found a spot near the wall that was as close to invisible as a large man in a good coat could manage. "I'll be direct," Nathan said. "Please," Rebecca said. She remained standing. "You've had 3 weeks to look at this inheritance and determine that it's too complicated for you to manage," Nathan said. "I'm here to make the process straightforward. The Western Prairie offer is on the table for another 10 days. After that, they've indicated they'll redirect their capital." He nodded toward Griggs. "We have the sale documents prepared. The estate management costs alone over the next year will exceed." "I've read the estate accounts," Rebecca said. Nathan stopped. "Your version of them," she said, "and the actual ones." Something shifted in Nathan's face. "I'm not sure what you—" Crowley submitted summary reports to the estate investors showing 3 consecutive years of declining performance across the Wyoming holdings, she said. Those summaries were used to justify the syndicate's valuation. She picked up the first page of her copied records. The actual property accounts show consistent improvement, documented improvement with specific dates and cost. She set the page on the table in front of Nathan. Caleb Mercer's lease property alone has increased in capital value by approximately 40% over 6 years, entirely through tenant-funded improvements that were recorded as estate gains. Nathan looked at the page. He looked at it with the expression of a man who has arrived with a plan and is now recalculating at speed. "Rebecca," he said, and his voice had changed lower, smoother, the voice he used when brute force wasn't available. "You have a great deal of information for someone who's been in Wyoming for 3 weeks. I've had excellent records to work from," she said. She didn't look at Caleb. She didn't need to. "The syndicate offer is still good money," Nathan said. "More than you could realize from these properties in 5 years of managing them yourself. A woman alone with no operational experience. I've been auditing accounts since I was 15, she said. And I've spent 3 weeks on this land, learning what operational experience actually looks like." Now she did look at Caleb briefly, for only a second, but it was a look that carried weight. "I know what's here. I know what it's worth, and I know what the people running it deserve." Nathan leaned back. He looked at Caleb. Caleb met his eyes and said nothing. Nathan looked back at his niece with the expression of a man reassessing an opponent. "You've been here 3 weeks," he said, "staying in a tenant's house. Being managed by a man who has obvious personal interest in your decision." His voice was careful now, the way a blade is careful, and pointed. "I want to make sure you understand that influence clearly." The room was very still. Caleb felt something rise in him that he pushed back down with deliberate effort. Not the time, not his fight to have. Rebecca looked at her uncle for a long, calm moment. "Mr. Mercer pulled me out of a flood," she said. "He gave me a roof and food and honest information. He has not once told me what decision to make about this property." She paused. "Can you say the same?" Nathan's mouth tightened. "Sign the documents, Rebecca." "No," she said. "The estate cannot be managed by—" "By whom?" she said. "Finish that sentence, Uncle Nathan." "I'd like to hear how you finish it." He didn't finish it. Griggs shifted his weight. Crowley had found something extremely interesting to look at in the middle distance. "This is sentiment," Nathan said. "You've spent 3 weeks with a charming tenant, and now you think you understand land management. In 6 months you'll be asking me to broker a sale, because the operational reality has—" "I've already terminated 2 predatory livestock buyer arrangements across the valley properties," Rebecca said. "I've identified 3 lease contracts that exceed legal rate limits under Wyoming territorial law, and I've begun renegotiating them. I've documented Crowley's accounting discrepancies in detail sufficient to present to the Territorial Land Board. She let that land exactly where she intended it to land. I have been busy, Uncle Nathan." The silence that followed was a different kind of silence from any that had come before it. Nathan looked at Crowley. Crowley looked at his boots. Nathan looked back at Rebecca. "You'd threaten your own family," he said. "I'd protect my inheritance," she said. "The way my grandfather intended." "Not the way you intended." Nathan stood up. He was controlling himself with visible effort, the effort of a man who has not been refused by someone he considered manageable in a very long time. "The sale documents can't stay in Mr. Griggs's case," she said. "Good day, Uncle Nathan." He looked at her for one long moment. Then he looked at Caleb, and then he made the mistake. "Rebecca Langford," he said, his voice dropping into something harder, "you are making this decision for the wrong reasons. And everyone in this room knows it." He looked at Caleb with a specific contempt that was not ambiguous. "This man is a tenant. He pays rent on land your grandfather owned. He has no more claim on your decisions than—" "Stop," Caleb said. His voice was quiet. It was the particular quiet that was not softness. Nathan stopped. "I have not said one word to this woman about what to do with this property," Caleb said. "Not one word. She came to her own conclusions from her own work, and you'd know that if you'd bothered to look at what she's actually done in 3 weeks, instead of riding up here to tell her what she doesn't understand." He kept his voice level. Kept his hand still. "She's not making a decision because of me. She's making a decision because she looked at what's actually here and made a judgment." He met Nathan's eyes without looking away. "I'd suggest that's exactly the kind of judgment you should be hoping for from someone running your family's estate." Nathan stared at him, not with rage. Something colder than rage. The look of a man storing information for later use. "You're very confident," Nathan said, "for a man who rents." "I'm confident she's right," Caleb said. "That's all." Nathan picked up his hat. He looked at Rebecca one final time, the look of a man who has not surrendered, only withdrawn to rethink his approach. "This isn't finished," he said. "I know," she said. He walked out. Griggs followed with the document case. Crowley paused at the door. "Miss Langford," Crowley said quietly. He didn't look at Nathan's retreating back. He looked at Rebecca directly. "The accounting discrepancies you found. I'd like to discuss them with you." "At your convenience." Rebecca studied him for a moment. "Tomorrow morning," she said, 7 o'clock. "Yes, ma'am," he said. He went out. The door closed. Rebecca stood in the middle of the kitchen for a moment, very still, and then she let out a breath that she had clearly been holding for longer than the conversation. Caleb said nothing. He let her have the moment. Then she turned and looked at him, and there was something in her face that he hadn't seen there before, something unguarded and unmanaged. Relief and exhaustion, and underneath both of those, something that looked like it had been waiting a long time for somewhere safe to be. "Thank you," she said. "Didn't do anything," he said. "You stayed," she said. He shrugged. "Said I wasn't leaving." She almost laughed. It didn't quite make it, but it moved across her face like the almost thing it was, and somehow that was enough. She sat down in the nearest chair. He put the coffee pot on the stove. What came after Nathan's visit was not resolution, it was the beginning of the hardest part. Rebecca had known it would be. She'd told Nathan the truth, the termination of the buyer arrangements, the lease reviews, the accounting records. What she hadn't told him was how much of it was still in progress, still fragile, still dependent on decisions from people she hadn't yet convinced. Crowley came at 7 o'clock the next morning. He came alone, without the lawyer, without Nathan, and he sat down across from Rebecca at the kitchen table, with the look of a man who has decided to change directions and is doing the arithmetic on what it will cost him. Caleb was in the barn. He'd offered to leave. Rebecca had said, "Stay if you want." He'd stayed. Crowley put his hands flat on the table. "The accounting irregularities," he said. "I want you to understand something. I did not manufacture them to deceive you personally. You manufactured them to present a picture that would justify the sale," Rebecca said. He was quiet. "To people who trusted the numbers," she said. "Including the tenants, who signed leases based on those numbers, and my grandfather, who made management decisions based on them before he died." She looked at him. "Who gave you the instruction, Mr. Crowley? Specifically?" Crowley looked at his hands. "Your uncle made it clear what outcome was expected," he said carefully. "I organized the records in a way that supported that outcome. And the money redirected from Mercer's rent to the Kansas properties. That was a legitimate internal transfer," he said. "Allowable under the estate structure. Allowable," Rebecca said. "But not disclosed to the tenant whose improvements were funding it." Crowley said nothing. "You're going to help me fix it," she said. He looked up. "Miss Langford, you have a choice," she said, and her voice was not unkind, but it was absolutely clear. "You can continue working for what Nathan wants, and I will present the accounting records to the Territorial Land Board and let them determine what was done with my grandfather's estate during his final years. Or you can help me correct it, and we will call the past what it was, mismanagement under pressure, and move forward." Crowley looked at her for a long time. "Your grandfather trusted me," he said. "I know he did," she said. "That's why I'm giving you the choice instead of making it for you." Something in Crowley's posture shifted. Not dramatically, he wasn't a dramatic man. Just the quiet rearrangement of a person who has picked a direction. "What do you need?" he said. "The original accounts," she said. "Not the summaries. All of them. And the correspondence with the syndicate." He nodded. "And Mr. Crowley," she said, "the other properties. Henderson, Cook. I need to know what was done to their leases as well." He nodded again, slowly. "It's similar," he said, "across the board." She looked at the window. "Then we have a great deal of work," she said. Caleb heard the end of it from where he stood near the barn door, not deliberately. But the morning was quiet enough, and he was close enough, and what he heard was the part where Crowley said, "It's similar, across the board." And he understood what that meant, understood it in his body, before his mind had fully processed it, that it wasn't just him. That what had been done to 6 years of his work had been done to other families in this valley, with less savings, with children, with less capacity to absorb the hit. He went back into the barn and stood there for a moment, with his hand on Jericho's neck. The horse turned and pushed his nose against Caleb's shoulder in the particular way that horses communicate what they cannot say. And Caleb stood there, full the fate of 6 years settle and shift and begin to mean something different than it had meant before. Not wasted, not exactly, but not what he'd thought it was. He'd believed he was building toward ownership, a future he was constructing slowly with his own hands. He'd been building it, all right, just not in the way he'd understood. He'd been building it into a legal document held by a family he'd never met, toward a sale that was supposed to scatter him and 30 other people from this valley like dust. And the woman sitting at his kitchen table with Crowley right now was the reason that hadn't happened yet. He stood there a long time. Jericho pushed him again. "I know," he said to the horse. He went back to work. That evening, Rebecca came to the barn. She didn't come with papers or questions about accounts. She came and stood at the open door and watched him fork for a moment and then said, "Caleb." He set the fork down. She said, "Nathan is going to come back with lawyers who know the territorial code better than I do. He's going to argue that I'm not competent to manage an estate of this size without a male trustee." She paused. "In Wyoming territory right now, that argument has more legal weight than it should." "What does he need to prove that?" Caleb said. "Evidence that I've made decisions contrary to the estate's financial interest," she said. Which, on paper, refusing the syndicate offer could be interpreted as. Caleb was quiet. "What he doesn't have," she said, "is anyone in this valley willing to testify that the investment under his direction was conducted in their interest." She met his eyes. "I need letters. From you, from Henderson, from the Cook family. Documenting what was actually done to your leases. What you built. What was taken." She paused. "It won't be comfortable for any of you." "No," he said. "I won't ask it if you're not willing," she said. "You have every right to stay out of it. You've already lost enough to this situation without losing more." He picked the fork back up. Not to use it, just to have something in his hands. "Rebecca," he said. "Yes. Do you think you can actually hold this?" She considered the question seriously, the way she considered everything thoroughly, without vanity about the answer. "I think so," she said, "if the records hold and Crowley cooperates and the tenants are willing to document what happened." She paused. "And if Nathan doesn't find something I haven't anticipated." "He'll find something," Caleb said. "That kind of man always does." "Yes," she said. "And then?" She looked at him directly. "And then I deal with it," she said. "That's all there is." He looked at her for a long moment. At this woman who'd arrived in his flood and taken 2 weeks to tell him her real name and, in the same period, had quietly, methodically begun dismantling a structure that had been stealing from him for 6 years. Who'd faced her uncle without flinching and given Crowley's a choice, and was now standing in his barn, asking for his help from a position that had no leverage over him. At all, not money, not property. Nothing but the plain honesty of what she was trying to do. "I'll write the letter," he said. "And I'll talk to Henderson and Cook." She nodded. "Thank you," she said. He nodded back. She turned to go. She stopped. He said, "Whatever your uncle tries, you should know that what you've done here in 3 weeks is more than most owners do in a decade." He said it simply, without embellishment, because it was true, and she needed to hear it stated plainly. "You came to land you'd never seen, and you learned it and you chose it." He looked at her. "That counts." She stood in the doorway with the evening behind her, and something moved through her expression that she didn't try to manage or contain. "I'm not sure I deserve that yet," she said. "No," he said. "But you're working toward it." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she went back to the house. Caleb stood in the barn and felt the thing he'd been feeling for days. The thing he hadn't named, because naming it would make it real, and making it real in this particular situation seemed like adding complexity to something that was already complicated enough. He named it anyway. Standing alone in his barn on land that belonged to someone else, with the sound of her footsteps on his porch and the smell of the Wyoming evening, and 6 years of his life behind him, and whatever came next in front of him. He named it, and then he went back to work, because work was what he had, and for now it was enough. The letters took 3 days to write. Not because the facts were hard to state. Caleb could have put the essential truth of his situation on paper in 10 sentences. The difficulty was precision. Rebecca had sat with him the first evening and explained what the letters needed to accomplish legally, which was different from what they needed to accomplish emotionally. and the two things had to coexist on the same page without either undermining the other. Too much anger and Griggs would call it grievance. Too dry, and it read like a man who had accepted the situation as normal. The letter needed to be exactly what it was, a factual account of specifics done to a specific person over a specific number of years, written in the voice of someone who understood what had been done to him and was prepared to say so plainly. Caleb wrote 4 drafts. Rebecca read each one without commenting on the ones that weren't right, which he appreciated. On the 4th draft, she read it through twice and set it down and said, "That's it." He looked at it. "You're sure? It's honest and it's clear and it's documented," she said. "That's all we need it to be." He folded it and put it with the copies of the accounts. The letters from Henderson and Cook took longer because Caleb had to ride to both properties and explain the situation without overselling it or underselling it, which required the particular kind of careful honesty he'd been practicing his whole life, but which was harder than usual when the people he was talking to had families and smaller margins and more to lose. Martin Henderson listened to the whole thing from the porch of his North Ridge ranch, with his arms crossed and his jaw set, and 3 kids visible through the window behind him. When Caleb finished, Henderson was quiet for a long moment. "She's actually turning down the syndicate," he said. "She tore the sale agreement in half in front of her uncle," Caleb said. "Yes." Henderson looked at the window, at his kids, at the land around his house that he'd been working for 9 years on a lease, that Caleb now knew had been structured with the same deliberate trap buried in it as Caleb's own. "And if Nathan Langford finds a way to force the sale anyway," Henderson said, "then the letters don't make our position worse than it already is," Caleb said. "But if she can hold it, the letters give her the legal foundation to restructure the leases. Fair rates, written improvement credit, actual purchase options." Henderson looked at him. "Purchase options," he said. "Her words," Caleb said. "Not mine." Henderson uncrossed his arms. "I'll write the letter," he said. The Cook family was harder. Tom Cook was a quiet man with a sick wife and a property in worse shape than either Caleb's or Henderson's. And he had the specific wariness of someone who had been disappointed by official processes enough times to treat any promise of improvement as a potential setup. He listened to Caleb the same way he did everything, carefully, without expression, weighing each word before he allowed it to affect him. "What does she want from us?" he said. "The truth of what was done," Caleb said. "Documented. And in return, she's not offering a trade," Caleb said. "She's asking for help building a legal case for something she's already decided to do regardless." Tom Cook looked at him for a long time. "You trust her," he said. It wasn't quite a question. Caleb thought about it not because he was unsure, but because Tom deserved a real answer instead of a quick one. "Yes," he said. "I do." Tom Cook wrote the letter that evening. Caleb brought both letters back to Dry Creek Ranch on the afternoon of the 4th day to find Rebecca at the table with Crowley, surrounded by account books he hadn't seen before, the full estate ledgers, not the summaries. Crowley had brought them from Cheyenne in a locked case that now sat open on the floor beside the table. He set the letters down. Rebecca looked at them. Something moved through her face, relief, and the particular kind of relief that comes with gratitude for something you weren't sure you'd receive. "Both of them?" she said. "Both," he said. Crowley looked at the letters with the expression of a man confirming the exact size of the problem he'd helped create. "The Cook lease in particular," Crowley said quietly, "is going to be difficult to defend. The rate was set against unimproved land values in 1877, and they've been paying it against improvements that he stopped himself." "I should have flagged it." "Yes," Rebecca said. "You should have." Crowley didn't argue. "The Henderson property has a secondary issue," Rebecca said, looking at the ledger page in front of her. "There's a water rights agreement from 1880 that gives the estate controlling access to the North Creek tributary. But the Hendersons have been managing that tributary, maintaining the banks, clearing debris, regulating without any compensation and without any formal acknowledgement that the work benefits 3 other properties downstream." Caleb looked at the page she was indicating. Martin never mentioned that. He probably didn't know it was compensable, she said. Most men in his position don't know what rights they have because nobody's ever been particularly interested in telling them. Crowley cleared his throat. The water rights agreement, he said, was set up to protect the estate's larger cattle operation to the south. The Hendersons were essentially maintaining infrastructure for a property they had no stake in. Then we changed that, Rebecca said. Crowley looked at her. Changing the water agreement requires Nathan's signature as secondary executor until the probate period closes. The room got very quiet. Caleb watched Rebecca's face. How long is the probate period, she said. 6 more months, Crowley said. Your grandfather's estate is substantial enough that the court required a 12-month administration period. Until then, certain classes of agreement, he stopped. Major structural changes to existing contracts technically require co-executor approval. Nathan is co-executor, Rebecca said. Yes, she was very still. He didn't mention that, she said, when he came with the sale documents. The sale would have been categorized differently, Crowley said carefully. Under a dissolution clause your grandfather included in the estate structure, a full sale of the Wyoming holdings would have required only your signature as primary beneficiary. He paused. Nathan drafted that clause himself 3 years ago, when your grandfather's health first began declining. The silence that followed was the kind that changes the shape of a room. Caleb said nothing. He watched Rebecca work through what Crowley had just told her, watched it move across her face in controlled stages, the understanding, the implication, the full shape of it. Nathan had structured the estate so that selling it required only her signature. But managing it, changing it, even improving the conditions for the people living on it that required his cooperation. The trap had been built before Edmund Langford was even in the ground. He planned this, she said. Not a question. I believe, Crowley said slowly, that he anticipated the inheritance would be difficult to manage, and that within a year you would find the sale option preferable to the operational complexity. He looked at his hands. I don't think he anticipated that you would spend 3 weeks learning the accounts. Or that she'd have help, Caleb said. Crowley looked at him. No, he said. I don't think he anticipated that either. Rebecca stood up. She walked to the window and stood there, with her back to both of them for a long moment. Then she turned around. What can I change without his signature? She said. Crowley pulled the ledger toward him and began going through it with the focused efficiency of a man who has decided to be useful and is applying himself entirely to that project. They worked until past midnight. What Rebecca could change without Nathan's approval was narrower than she'd hoped but larger than nothing. She could renegotiate the basic lease rates for properties that were month to month. She could issue formal written acknowledgement of documented improvements as estate records. She could terminate the predatory livestock buyer arrangements because those were operational contracts, not structural agreements. She could establish a written maintenance compensation structure for the Henderson water work going forward, even if she couldn't retroactively restructure the underlying rights. She could not, without Nathan, formally issue long-term purchase options. She could not change the North Creek water agreement. She could not unilaterally restructure the Cook lease, which had a fixed-term clause running another 3 years. It was enough to matter and not enough to be everything, and Rebecca sat with that tension for one morning, and then set it aside and did what she could do, because that was all there was. Caleb watched her work with the specific admiration of someone who recognizes in another person a quality he values in himself, the ability to look at what's in front of you without flinching at either the possibility or the limitation, and to keep moving through both. She rode to the Henderson property herself and explained the water rights situation to Martin in person, which was not easy and which she did not make easy by softening the parts that were hard. She told him exactly what the agreement said, and exactly what she could and couldn't change right now, and exactly what she intended to pursue when the probate period closed. Martin Henderson listened to all of it. Then he said, You rode out here yourself to tell me that. Yes, she said. You could have sent a letter, she said. I could have. Martin looked at her for a long moment. All right, Miss Langford, he said. We'll talk again in 6 months. She rode to the Cook property. She sat with Tom and his wife Clara, who was thin and tired in the way of someone managing a chronic illness on frontier rations, and she told them the same things she'd told Martin, and the same thing she couldn't yet promise. And she told them specifically that the lease rate would be reduced immediately to a fair assessment of the land's actual pre-improvement value. Tom Cook's wife reached across the table and put her hand over Rebecca's. Rebecca held it together until she was back on the road. Caleb was waiting when she rode in that evening. He'd seen her face from 50 yards, and he didn't ask how it went. He took her horse, unsaddled it, led it to water, and when he came back to the house, she was sitting on the porch steps with her face in her hands. He sat down beside her. He didn't say anything. After a moment, she lowered her hands. Clara Cook, she said. Her husband has been stretching that lease payment every quarter for 3 years to keep from losing the property. She stared at the road. She looked at me like I was the first person who'd come to that house in a long time with something other than a demand. Caleb was quiet. I want to fix it, she said, all of it. Now I know, he said. 6 months is 2 people like the Cook, she said. Yes, he said. She looked at him. You're not going to tell me there's nothing to be done. Wasn't planning to, he said. She looked at him steadily. What would you do? He thought about it. Nathan needs you to feel like you can't manage without his cooperation, he said. That's the whole structure. That's what he built, a situation where the easy path is the sale and the hard path requires him. He paused. So you don't make the hard path require him. I just told you the probate structure. The structure requires his signature for certain legal categories, Caleb said. It doesn't require his goodwill for everything else. There are things that don't need a signature at all. What you charge for rent, how you communicate with your tenants, what you put in writing. He looked at her. A letter from the estate owner to every tenant in this valley acknowledging their documented improvements and stating your intention to honor fair purchase options when the probate period closes. That letter is not a legal contract. But it's a record, and it changes what these families are living with every day. She was very still. That's not legally binding, she said. No, he said, but neither is Nathan's plan to make your life difficult enough that you sell. He's been working in the space between legal and actual for 6 years on this estate. You can do the same thing in the other direction. She looked at him for a long moment. You're smarter about this than you let people think, she said. I've been watching someone run it the wrong way for 6 years, he said. Gives a man ideas about how it ought to go. Something shifted in her expression. Something that was more than appreciation, something that was personal in a way the previous weeks hadn't quite arrived at directly, even when they'd been moving toward it. She looked away first. I'll write the letters tonight, she said. I'll make coffee, he said. The letters went out to every tenant in the valley within 4 days. 12 families altogether. Rebecca wrote each one personally in her own hand, with specific reference to the documented improvements on each individual property. She stated clearly what she intended to do when the probate period ended. She stated clearly that the syndicate sale was off the table. She did not promise what she couldn't yet legally deliver. She promised what she could, that they would be seen, that their work would be counted, that the person holding the paper on their land understood what that work had cost them and intended to honor it. The responses came back faster than she'd expected. Most were brief, a few sentences, the language of men who put words on paper rarely and chose them carefully when they did. But they kept coming, folded notes delivered by riders or left at the Millhaven post, and every one of them said some version of the same thing: we'll stay. Martin Henderson rode to Dry Creek personally and left a note with Caleb because Rebecca was out on the property. The note said, "My wife wanted me to tell you thank you." We haven't slept this well in 2 years. Caleb put the note on the table where she'd find it when she came back. She found it. She stood at the table and read it 3 times. Then she sat down and pressed both hands flat on the table and stayed there for a moment with her eyes closed. Caleb was in the kitchen doorway. "All right," he said. She opened her eyes. "Yes," she said. And for the first time since he'd carried her out of that flood, she said it the way a person says it, when it's actually true. Nathan came back on the 31st day. He didn't bring Griggs this time. He came alone, which was itself a message, a deliberate recalibration of approach, dropping the official machinery in favor of something he probably considered more effective. Personal. Family. He arrived at mid-morning when Rebecca was at the table with the estate books, and Caleb was visible through the window, working the south fence line. Nathan came to the porch door and knocked, and when Rebecca opened it, he looked at her with an expression that was almost something human. "May I come in?" he said. She stepped back. He came in and sat down and looked at the estate books on the table, and then at Rebecca across from him, and he said, "I want to understand what you're doing." "You've seen the letters I sent to the tenants," she said. "Yes." He looked at the books. "You've been thorough." "I've tried to be." He was quiet for a moment. The quality of his silence was different from the last visit, less strategic, more genuinely uncertain, which was interesting, because Nathan Langford did not seem like a man who spent much time in genuine uncertainty. "Your grandfather," he said, in his last year, talked about this valley. He talked about it differently from the other holdings." He paused. "I thought it was sentiment. Old age. Maybe it was," Rebecca said. "Or maybe he knew something about what was here that the accounts weren't showing." Nathan looked at the window, at Caleb's figure moving along the fence line in the distance. "The tenant," he said. "Caleb Mercer," she said. "His name is Caleb Mercer." "The accounting you've done," Nathan said carefully. "The underpayment he experienced. You intend to address that?" "As fully as the probate structure allows," she said. "And completely when it closes." Nathan was quiet. "That will cost the estate," he said. "It will cost the estate money that should never have been taken," she said. He looked at her with something she hadn't seen from him before, not agreement exactly, but the absence of the dismissiveness that had characterized every previous interaction. He was looking at her the way he would look at a professional. The way he would look at someone whose position he was reassessing. "You've talked to the other tenants," he said. "I've met with all of them personally. And they support your management approach. They're willing to give it time," she said. "Which is what I've asked for, and what they deserve." Nathan looked at the estate ledgers. 6 months, he said. "Until the probate closes, yes." He looked at her. "And you want my cooperation for the water agreement and the Cook lease restructure?" "Yes," she said. He was very quiet for a long moment. "The syndicate offer," he said. "If I bring them back at a higher number." "No," she said. "No," she said again. "Not at any number." "This isn't about the money, Uncle Nathan. It never was. This is about what my grandfather built and what the people on this land built inside it, and I'm not selling either one of them." He looked at her for a long time. Then he said something she hadn't expected. "You sound like him," he said. "Edmund, when he was young, and still." He stopped. Before the business of it took over, he looked at his hands. I had forgotten he used to talk about the land that way. What it produced in people, what responsibility it carried. Rebecca said nothing. She let him sit with that. "The water agreement," he said eventually. "The Cook lease. I'll look at them." It was not a yes. But it was not a no. "That's all I'm asking," she said. He stood up. He looked at the estate books one more time, and at the copies of Caleb's accounts, and at the letters from the tenants that Rebecca had stacked carefully to one side. "You've done considerable work," he said. "Yes," she said. He picked up his hat. "I'll be in Millhaven through the week," he said. "Send Crowley to me with the water agreement documents." He walked out. Rebecca sat very still for a moment after the door closed. Then she got up and went to the porch and called across the yard, "Caleb." He looked up from the fence line. "He's going to look at the water agreement," she called. Caleb straightened. He was too far to read his expression clearly, but she could see the set of his shoulders change, some long-held tension releasing, the physical version of a breath let out. He raised one hand, she raised hers back. The drought came in August. Not the ordinary summer dryness that Wyoming always carried, something harder, sustained. The kind of dry that cracked the creek beds and turned grass to paper and made men who'd ranched for 30 years look at the sky with expressions that weren't quite prayer and weren't quite resignation, but lived somewhere between the two. The Dry Creek tributary dropped by a third in the first week and by half in the second. By the third week, every rancher in the valley was doing arithmetic. They didn't want to do how many head could the available water support, how long until the upstream sources gave out entirely, which animals to sell now before the market filled up with desperate ranchers trying to do the same thing. Rebecca's estate owned the primary upstream water rights. Nathan, still in Millhaven reviewing the restructure documents, sent a letter the second week of the drought with a simple and direct suggestion: prioritize the estate's largest holding, the South Range cattle operation, and let the tributary manage the smaller operations as best it could. It's the financially responsible choice, his letter said. You cannot save everyone. Rebecca read the letter. She folded it. She put it in the estate correspondence file. Then she rode out to the creek headworks and opened the irrigation channel to every ranch in the valley according to livestock count. Her own South Range cattle operation got its proportional share and nothing extra. She rode back to Dry Creek and told Caleb what she'd done. He was quiet for a moment. Your profit margin this quarter, he said. Will be lower, she said. Yes, by how much? She told him the number. He looked at her. That's not a small reduction, he said. No, she said. It isn't. And Nathan will have an opinion, she said. He usually does. Caleb sat down across from her at the table. He looked at her with the specific look of a man revising an estimate he'd already revised twice. Why, he said. She looked at him. What do you mean, why? You could have protected your own operation, he said. Legally. Nobody could have argued it. He paused. So why didn't you? She looked at him steadily. Because I can, she said. Because the water is mine to distribute, and I have enough to share if I share it carefully, and these families don't have another option. She paused. And because if I take more than my share because I legally can, I am exactly the kind of owner this valley has been suffering under for 6 years. Caleb said nothing. That's not what my grandfather meant this land to be, she said. I don't think. I think he lost track of it, at the end, because he trusted the wrong people to manage it. But I've read his original letters, from when he first took the Wyoming holdings. He wanted cattle country that worked, not extraction. She looked at her hands. I want to give him that, even if it costs me a quarter's margin. Caleb was very quiet. Then what was it like, growing up in that family? She glanced at him. It was a different kind of question, not about the estate, not about the legal structure, not about what came next. A personal question, the kind he hadn't asked in 31 days of close proximity. Complicated, she said. He waited. My father's family had money and my mother's family had land, she said slowly. And both of them spent most of my childhood treating those two things as the whole of what mattered. She paused. My grandfather was the exception. He used to take me with him when he reviewed properties. He'd walk the fence lines and ask the tenants questions, real questions, about the grass condition, about the water table, about what the land needed. She was quiet for a moment. He's the reason I know what I know, about drainage and accounts and what questions to ask. She looked at the window. I think he knew he was leaving this to me. I think the will wasn't an accident. He trusted you with it, Caleb said. Yes, she said. And I spent 2 weeks sitting at your table, not telling you whose land you were on. You were figuring out what you were going to do with it, he said. That's not entirely an excuse. No, he said. But something. She looked at him. Caleb, she said. The way she said his name had changed over the past weeks. He'd noticed it, the gradual dropping of the careful distance, the way a word could carry different weight depending on whether it was being used to address a person or to reach them. "I want to ask you something," she said. "Go ahead." She was quiet for a moment, organizing it. "When I first told you who I was really told you, you said I should have told you sooner. And you were right." She looked at him directly. "But you didn't ask me to leave. You didn't change, the way most men would have changed, knowing that the situation was." She stopped. Why? He thought about it. "Because it wasn't the information that mattered," he said. "It was what you were going to do with it." He paused. "I didn't know yet. But I had a sense," she said. "You were already fixing things," he said, "before you told me. You found the livestock buyer problem without anyone asking you to. You identified the drainage. You were already behaving like someone who intended to be responsible for this place." He shrugged. "The name didn't change what I was already seeing." She looked at him for a long time. "Most people," she said, "see the land first. The property. The money," he said. She stopped. I saw a woman who knew what underpayment looked like and was angry about it, even before it was her problem to be angry about," he said. "That tells a man something." Something moved through her face, the deep movement, the kind that happened under the controlled surface, the kind he'd been catching glimpses of for weeks. "I need to tell you something," she said. He waited. "The purchase option," she said. "When the probate closes. The one I've promised the tenants." She met his eyes. "I've been thinking about how to structure yours differently." He went still. "Not a gift," she said quickly, "not charity. I want you to understand that before I say the rest." She paused. "I've been looking at the estate's operational needs and at what this property actually requires to run properly. Dry Creek needs someone who knows cattle, knows the land, knows the water management, knows the fence lines." She stopped. "Someone who spent 6 years learning it." "You're describing me," he said. "Yes," she said. "Go on," he said. "What I'm proposing," she said, "is a partnership arrangement. Formal, documented. You provide operational management and cattle expertise. The estate provides land and capital. Profits shared according to documented contribution." She paused. "Not a lease. An actual partnership. With legal standing." Caleb was very quiet. "You'd be giving me partial ownership," he said. "I'd be recognizing partial ownership that your 6 years of work has arguably already established," she said. "And structuring a legal framework around it that protects both of us." She paused. "This is not about the flood, Caleb. This is not about gratitude. This is about what makes operational sense for the estate and what is fair given what has happened here." She held his gaze. "And I will not pretend there isn't also a personal reason. But I want you to know the practical one is real and stands on its own." He looked at her. He looked at the estate books on the table. He looked at the window, and, beyond it, the land he'd spent 6 years, building into something worth having. Then he looked back at her. "I can't accept that," he said. Her face changed. She hadn't expected that answer. For the first time in their weeks together, he saw her genuinely surprised. "Caleb, not because I don't want it," he said. "I want it more than I know how to say." He paused. "But I won't take it as a repair for what was done to me, or as thanks for pulling you out of that creek, or because you feel responsible for 6 years of bad leases that weren't your doing." He looked at her directly. "If I'm going to stand on this land as a partner in it, I'm going to earn that standing on terms that are clean. That don't start from guilt or obligation." He paused. "I need you to understand that." She was very still. "Then what would you accept?" she said. "Time," he said. "Give me the fair purchase option when probate closes. Set a real price based on a real appraisal of what I can afford, not what it's worth to a syndicate, what's fair against my savings and what I've already contributed. Let me make an offer, and if the offer works, we negotiate from there." She looked at him. "That's going to take longer," she said. "Yes," he said. "And harder," she said. "Yes," he said. "But it'll be mine at the end of it." He looked at her steadily. And ours, if that's where it goes, will mean something because of how we got there. Something broke open in her expression, not apart, but open the way a fist opens into a hand. "You are," she said slowly, "the most infuriating man I have ever met in my life." "Probably," he said. "You know that accepting what I offered would be entirely reasonable," she said. "Yes," he said. "And you won't. Not that way." She stared at him. Then she said, "And if I had something valuable, do you remember saying that?" He looked at her. "You asked me that. On the first week. You said it wouldn't change what I was worth," she said. "I need you to hear that the same applies in reverse." She paused. "Your worth to me is not diminished by what you won't accept. I want you to know that." "I know," he said. They sat at that table in the drought heat of the Wyoming August, with the estate books between them and 6 years of complicated history behind them, and the specific charged silence of two people who have both said something true, and neither knows quite what comes next. Then Rebecca stood up and picked up the estate ledger and said, "I'm going to write to Nathan about the Cook lease tonight." "All right," he said. She went to the desk. He stayed at the table. After a moment he said, "Rebecca." She looked up. "Thank you," he said, "for the offer, even if I can't take it the way you made it." She looked at him for a moment. "Thank you," she said, "for being the kind of man who can't." She went back to the letter. He stayed at the table and listened to her pen moving across the paper and felt the weight of the future settling around them, both not resolved, not easy, not simple but present, and real, and built on something solid enough to stand on. Outside, the drought held, but somewhere upstream, the water was still running. And Rebecca had made sure it reached everyone who needed it. That, Caleb thought, was the whole of what a person could do. Make sure it reaches everyone who needs it. He watched her write. And he stayed. The drought broke in September. Not dramatically, not with the kind of storm that had started everything, not with violence and flood, and a woman trapped in rising water. It broke the way most things in Wyoming eventually broke, quietly and without ceremony. A week of slow gray skies that delivered steady rain and filled the creek beds back to their ordinary depth and turned the burned grass a tentative, cautious green. The kind of green that looked like it wasn't sure yet whether it was safe to come back. Caleb stood at the south fence line the morning after the first real rain and looked at the drainage channel he'd cut in July and watched the water move through it, exactly the way Rebecca had said it would, clean and efficient, carrying the excess out to the creek bed instead of pooling in the basin and stressing the roots. It worked. It had always been going to work. He just hadn't seen it until someone showed him how to look. He thought about that for a moment. Then he picked up his tools and went back to work. The probate period closed in February. The letter from the territorial court came on a Tuesday, addressed to Miss Rebecca Langford, and she read it at the kitchen table with Caleb across from her and her coffee going cold at her elbow. And when she finished reading, she set it down and pressed her palm flat on top of it the way she pressed her palm on things that mattered. "It's done," she said. "All of it," he said. "Full ownership, uncontested," she said. Nathan filed a formal objection in November, and the court rejected it. She looked up. Crowley testified. Caleb went still. Crowley testified against Nathan. "He testified to the accurate accounting," she said. "Which is the same thing in this case." She picked up her coffee. "He said my grandfather's original management intentions were clear and that the estate had drifted from them under external pressure." She paused. He was more honest in that courtroom than he'd been in 12 years of managing the estate. What happened to him? After. "I offered him his position back," she said. "Under different terms." Caleb raised an eyebrow. "He's good at the work," she said simply. "He was doing the wrong work for the wrong person." "That's correctable." She looked at the letter again. He accepted. Caleb shook his head slowly, not in disagreement, more in the way of a man adjusting to a version of the world that keeps being more complicated and more decent than he expects. "The Cook lease," he said. "Restructured as of January 1st, she said. Fair rate improvement credit applied. Tom sent a note. She paused. Clara is better. The winter wasn't as hard. Caleb looked at the table. The water agreement, he said. Signed by Nathan in December, she said. He didn't make it easy, but he signed it. She looked at Caleb. He came out here in November, did I tell you? While you were at the Henderson place. No, Caleb said, you didn't. He walked the property, she said. By himself for about an hour. Just walked it. She was quiet for a moment. When he came back, he sat on the porch and he said she stopped. He said your fence lines were the straightest he'd seen in Wyoming. Caleb was quiet. He didn't say it to you, she said. I know. But he said it. Caleb looked at the window. That's supposed to fix something? No, she said. I don't think he thought it would. I think he just noticed. Finally, she paused. Some men need a long time to see what's in front of them. He looked back at her. Some do, he said. He brought her the offer in March. He'd been working on the numbers since October carefully. The way he did everything, without rushing it, without letting the wanting of it make him careless. He'd talked to the bank in Millhaven. He'd had the property independently appraised by a man from Cheyenne who didn't know either of them and had no stake in the outcome. He'd gone through his savings account line by line and calculated what he could put forward as a down payment and what he could sustain as a structured payment against the remainder over 5 years. It wasn't the full value of the property. He knew that. He brought it anyway because he'd told her he would, and because it was every honest dollar he had. He put the paper on the table in front of her on a Wednesday morning without preamble, the way he did things directly, without dressing it up. She looked at the number. She looked at it for a long time. He sat across from her and waited and did not try to fill the silence. This is what you have, she said. He said. The appraisal, she said. She looked at the appraiser's name on the document. You had it done independently. Didn't want you to think I was working the number, he said. She looked at the offer again, at the difference between what he was offering and what the property was worth. Caleb, she said. I know it's not full value, he said. That's why I'm proposing a payment structure. 5 years. Documented. He paused. It's a real offer. It's not everything you could get from someone else, but it's real and it's clean and there's no history attached to it that either of us has to work around. She was quiet. And if I propose something different, she said carefully. Such as she looked at him. A partnership, she said. Not the one I offered before. Not from guilt or obligation or because of the flood. She held his gaze. A genuine business partnership. Your capital against a reduced purchase price on the residential portion of the property. Joint operational management of the cattle operation. Profits split according to a structure we negotiate together, on paper, with a lawyer present. She paused. And personally, whatever we are personally, that is separate from the business structure. So that neither one contaminates the other. Caleb looked at her for a long moment. You've been thinking about this for a while, he said. Since October, she said. Since I told you I wouldn't take the first offer, he said. Yes, she said. Because you were right that the first offer was wrong. But the reason it was wrong wasn't the partnership itself. It was the foundation it was standing on. She paused. You needed to make a real offer first, so it would be clear that you could. So it would be clear to both of us that what comes next isn't rescue, from either direction. He was very still. The residential portion, he said. The house, and the immediate grazing acreage, she said. The south pasture, the north fence line, the water access, she paused. The part you built. He looked at his offer on the table. He looked at her. You designed this so the number works, he said. I designed this so it's fair, she said. There's a difference. Is there, he said. Yes, she said. Fair takes the history into account. Fair says 6 years of improvement work has established something that a purchase price should reflect. Fair is not the same as charity. She met his eyes steadily. I am not giving you anything. I am proposing a structure in which what you've already contributed is counted as part of what you're bringing to the table." She paused. "That's just honest accounting." Caleb sat back. He looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then at his hands, then at her. "If we do this," he said. "If we do this, I need you to know something." "Tell me," she said. "I'm not easy to work with," he said. "I have opinions about how a cattle operation should run, and I don't let them go easily. I'll disagree with you on real things." He paused. "I'll be right some of the time and wrong some of the time. Same as everyone." "I'm aware," she said. "I've been watching you work for 8 months. And personally," he said, "whatever that is, the way you said it's not going to be simple either. I don't know how to be around someone I care about without caring about them, which means I'm going to have opinions about things that aren't strictly my business." Something moved through her face. "Noted," she said. "And you," he said. "You're going to be the landowner and the estate manager and the woman who knows more about the legal structure of this valley than any man in it, and people are going to have opinions about all of that for a long time. And some days that's going to be harder than it should be, and I'm not always going to know how to help with that." "I know," she said. "So," she said. They looked at each other across the kitchen table on a cold March morning, with the offer paper between them and eight months of shared work and honest argument, and two people steadily becoming essential to each other laid out around them like the fence lines they'd both been repairing. "Yes," he said. She let out a breath. "Yes," she said. They signed the partnership agreement in Millhaven on a Thursday in April, in the office of a lawyer neither of them knew particularly well, which was the point. Crowley witnessed it. Martin Henderson came in from the North Ridge to witness it too, uninvited and unnecessary from a legal standpoint, and when Rebecca asked him why he'd made the ride, he said, "Felt like something a man ought to see in person." He shook Caleb's hand and tipped his hat to Rebecca and rode back the way he'd come. Nathan received a copy by post. He sent back a single-line response, "I hope you know what you're doing." Rebecca wrote back, "I do." She meant both the business and the rest of it. The line covered both. By June, the frame of the new house was up. Not finished nothing in Wyoming was finished on schedule. Which was a fact of life that Rebecca had come to understand with the philosophical acceptance of someone who had spent enough time on the frontier to know that the land operated on its own timeline, and you either adjusted or you suffered. But the frame was up, and the south wall was close, and on evenings when the work was done they would stand in the unfinished structure together and look at where the rooms would be and argue productively about the placement of the windows. She wanted the east window wider because of the morning light. He wanted the west window wider because of the evening. They compromised the way they compromised on most things, by being honest about what each of them actually needed rather than defending positions for the sake of it. Both windows were widened. The two chairs appeared on the porch of the old ranch house one afternoon in early June. Caleb had made them over the winter from timber he'd cut off the North Ridge, not elegant, but solid, the kind of furniture built to last, rather than to look like it would. He'd put them out one morning while Rebecca was riding the east boundary, and when she came back and saw them, she stood in the yard for a moment before tying her horse. "You made those," she said. "Needed somewhere to sit in the evenings," he said. She looked at them for another moment. Then she went inside and came back with 2 cups of coffee and sat in one of them and handed him the other. They sat on that porch in the June evening and watched the light go off the western ridge, and the valley below them was green from the spring rains, and the cattle were moving slowly in the south pasture, the way well-managed cattle move, without urgency. And the irrigation channel was running clean through the summer grass, and the fence lines ran straight to the horizon. Rebecca held her coffee cup in both hands. "I owe you my life," she said. It was the first time she'd said it since the night he'd carried her out of the flood. Caleb looked at her. "You don't owe me anything," he said. She looked toward Dry Creek Ranch, at the barn he'd rebuilt, at the fence lines he'd straightened, at the frame of the new house rising at the edge of the yard, at the ledger visible through the window where they'd both spent months building something honest out of what had been used to deceive. "I know," she said. That distinction mattered. They both understood why. She wasn't saying it because she owed him. She was saying it because a year ago he'd pulled her from a flood and said, "Keep your life," and she'd made something of it worth keeping. And she wanted him to know she understood the difference between surviving something and choosing what to do with the survival. He took her hand, not dramatically, not with speeches. Just the quiet claiming of something both of them had been moving toward for a long time. Across accounts and arguments and honest work, and the particular kind of trust that builds between people who have repeatedly told each other difficult truths and stayed. She held his hand back. The valley settled into evening around them. The creek ran soft below the cottonwoods. The cattle grazed. The new house frame stood against the sky with the two widened windows waiting for glass. It wasn't finished, but it was theirs, earned in the only way that anything worth having ever truly is. Not through ownership alone, not through rescue, not through money or family name or the legal weight of a deed. Through showing up, day after day, for the land and for each other, until staying stopped being a decision and became simply the truth of where they were. Caleb Mercer had spent 6 years building a home on ground he didn't own. Rebecca Langford had inherited land she hadn't earned and spent a year learning what it meant to deserve it. Neither of them had become the other's reward. They had simply, steadily, become each other's choice, the kind made freely, with clear eyes and full knowledge of the cost, by two people who had both been given the chance to walk away and had chosen, every single time, to stay. That was the whole of it. That was enough.